Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we've been living next to our whole lives. There's something about discovering that the people we trust most might be the ones with the deepest secrets to hide. In the Montana wilderness, an old mountain man named Enoch Rayder was just trying to live out his days in peace with his faithful dog, Jasper. But when Jasper caught a scent that led them off their usual path, they found an old wagon hidden in the forest for 30 years. Inside were stolen army payroll notes and journals from a decades-old heist. The name in one of those journals belonged to the current sheriff of the nearby village. Now Enoch faced an impossible choice between stirring up the truth or letting sleeping dogs lie. What would you do if you discovered your town's most trusted man might be hiding the darkest secret of all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Dead Horse Ridge like a familiar old blanket, the kind that's been through too many winters but still brings comfort on cold days. Enoch Rayder stood on the porch of his weathered cabin, watching the sun struggle through the pine canopy while his coffee steamed in the crisp October air. At 63, he'd grown accustomed to these quiet moments before the world stirred to life, moments when a man could reflect on the choices that had led him to this particular patch of Montana wilderness. His limp was more pronounced in the morning cold, a souvenir from Vietnam that had followed him home like a persistent shadow. The doctors at the VA hospital had called it service-related, as if those two words could somehow capture the weight of carrying wounded men through jungle mud or the sound of mortars falling like deadly rain. But Enoch had long since made peace with the pain. It reminded him he was still breathing, still walking, still here when so many others weren't. Jasper, his 12-year-old blue-tick coonhound, emerged from the cabin with the deliberate dignity of a dog who understood his place in the morning routine. The hound's coat showed traces of gray around his muzzle, and his eyes held the wisdom that comes from years of reading the forest's subtle signs. Enoch had found Jasper as a pup, abandoned on the roadside near Glacier National Park, and they'd been inseparable ever since. In a world where people seemed to complicate everything they touched, Jasper offered something rare, uncomplicated loyalty. "Morning, old boy," Enoch murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. Jasper's tail wagged once, a measured response that conveyed both affection and the understanding that breakfast would be appreciated. Their relationship operated on a currency of mutual respect, built through countless mornings like this one and evenings by the fire when the wind howled through the peaks. The cabin itself told the story of a man who'd chosen solitude over society. Built with his own hands from local timber, it sat nestled against a stand of ponderosa pines that provided shelter from the worst of winter's fury. The structure was solid, practical, and free of unnecessary ornamentation, much like the man who'd built it. A stone chimney rose from the center, sending a thin column of smoke into the morning sky, and the windows were positioned to catch the first light of dawn and the last glow of sunset. Inside, the cabin reflected 20 years of careful accumulation. Books lined the walls, histories, biographies, and classic novels that had provided companionship during the long winter nights. A well-maintained rifle rested above the fireplace, not as decoration, but as a tool that had put meat on the table and deterred the occasional bear with poor judgment. The furniture was handmade and sturdy, built to last by someone who understood the value of quality craftsmanship. Enoch had chosen this life deliberately, after his wife Sarah had passed from cancer 15 years earlier. The doctors in Billings had done everything they could, but sometimes the fight is already decided before the first treatment begins. Her death had left him with a choice: stay in town, surrounded by memories and well-meaning neighbors, or find a place where grief could transform into something more manageable. The mountains had offered sanctuary, and he'd accepted their invitation. The nearest town, 3 Pines, lay 7 miles down a winding dirt road that became treacherous in winter and challenging in spring. Population 847, according to the weathered sign at the town limits, though Enoch suspected the number was optimistic. 3 Pines existed because the railroad had needed a water stop and the mountains had provided timber, but both industries had long since moved on. What remained was a collection of determined souls who'd chosen to stay despite the economic headwinds. Sheriff Marcus Dalton had been elected to keep the peace in 3 Pines for the past 8 years, running unopposed in the last 3 elections. At 55, he possessed the kind of steady demeanor that inspired confidence in nervous tourists and respect from longtime residents. Dalton had grown up in these mountains, served a stint in the army, and returned home to raise his family. His reputation was built on fairness, competence, and the rare quality of actually listening when people brought their problems to his office. Enoch's interactions with the sheriff had been limited, but positive. Dalton would occasionally drive up to check on him during harsh winters, and Enoch would nod his appreciation without feeling obligated to invite the man inside. They understood each other in the way that independent men do, respectful distance seasoned with mutual recognition. The morning routine never varied. After coffee and reflection, Enoch would prepare a simple breakfast, while Jasper waited with the patience of a saint. Then they'd check the small garden where he grew vegetables, inspect the generator that provided electricity, and walk the perimeter of his property. These weren't mere chores, but rituals that connected him to the land and provided structure to days that might otherwise drift without purpose. Today felt different, though Enoch couldn't identify why. Jasper seemed more alert than usual, his head cocked as if listening to sounds that existed just beyond human perception. The dog had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense changes in weather, wildlife patterns, and even Enoch's moods. If Jasper was picking up on something unusual, it was worth paying attention. The path behind Dead Horse Ridge had become familiar territory over the years. Enoch used it for his longer walks, following game trails that wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and across meadows where wildflowers painted the landscape in summer. The ridge itself earned its name from a grim discovery made by early settlers, the skeletal remains of pack animals that had wandered too far from their train and perished in a particularly harsh winter. Wildlife thrived in this untouched corner of Montana. Enoch had spotted elk, deer, black bears, and even the occasional mountain lion during his wanderings. He'd learned to read their signs, to understand the intricate relationships that kept the ecosystem in balance. The forest operated according to rules far older and more reliable than anything humans had devised, and there was comfort in that consistency. His own past seemed both distant and immediate in this setting. The war years had taught him about courage and loss, about the arbitrary nature of survival and the weight of carrying on when others couldn't. Sarah's illness had reinforced those lessons, adding layers of understanding about love and letting go that only come through lived experience. The mountains had provided a classroom for processing these memories, transforming them from sources of pain into foundations of wisdom. The people of 3 Pines knew Enoch primarily through reputation and occasional glimpses. He was the hermit who lived up on the ridge, the veteran who kept to himself but could be counted on to help during emergencies. When the Hendersons' barn had caught fire 3 summers ago, Enoch had appeared with shovels and helped contain the blaze until the volunteer fire department arrived. When young Billy Matthews got lost during a camping trip, Enoch had joined the search party and used his tracking skills to locate the boy. These interactions revealed something important about his character. Solitude hadn't made him antisocial, merely selective about human contact. He understood the difference between being alone and being lonely, and he'd chosen the former while maintaining the capacity for connection when circumstances warranted it. The morning was advancing toward midday when Enoch decided to extend their walk. Beyond the usual boundaries, Jasper seemed eager to explore, his nose working overtime as they moved deeper into territory they rarely visited. The forest here grew thicker, with deadfall creating natural obstacles and undergrowth that required careful navigation. It was the kind of place where a man could easily lose his bearings. But Enoch had learned to read the landscape like a familiar book. They paused at a small clearing where sunlight filtered through the canopy and created pools of warmth on the forest floor. Enoch pulled out his water bottle and shared a drink with Jasper, listening to the subtle sounds that indicated a healthy ecosystem. Birds calling from hidden perches, the rustle of small creatures moving through undergrowth, the whisper of wind through pine needles. This was where contentment lived. In moments like these, when the complexities of human nature seemed distant and manageable, Enoch had found peace in simplicity, in the rhythm of seasons and the reliability of natural cycles. He'd traded ambition for tranquility, social connections for self-sufficiency, and the bargain had proven worthwhile. But as they prepared to continue their walk, Jasper's behavior shifted noticeably. The dog's ears perked up, his body tensing with the focused attention of a hunter detecting prey. Something had captured his interest, something that lay deeper in the forest, where shadows gathered and secrets might hide undisturbed for decades. Enoch trusted his companion's instincts completely. In all their years together, Jasper had never led him astray or shown interest in anything that proved dangerous or pointless. If the dog sensed something worth investigating, it was worth following that lead to see where it might take them. "What is it, boy?" Enoch asked quietly, though he knew the question was more for his own benefit than the dog's. Jasper was already moving toward whatever had caught his attention, his nose close to the ground and his tail held high with excitement. The trees grew thicker as they followed Jasper's lead, and the undergrowth became more challenging to navigate. Enoch found himself pushing through tangles of brush and stepping over fallen logs that had been decomposing for years. The forest here felt older, more mysterious, as if it had been waiting patiently for someone to discover its hidden secrets. They were venturing into territory that maps couldn't capture and GPS couldn't navigate, the kind of wilderness where time moved differently and the past might be preserved like insects in amber. Enoch felt his curiosity building alongside his physical exertion, wondering what could have attracted Jasper's attention so powerfully. The morning had started like countless others, with coffee and contemplation, and the simple pleasure of sharing space with a loyal companion. But as they moved deeper into the forest's embrace, Enoch sensed that this day would be different. Sometimes the most significant discoveries begin with the smallest deviations from routine, and Jasper's unusual interest suggested they were about to encounter something that would challenge the peaceful equilibrium Enoch had worked so hard to achieve. Jasper's nose led them through a maze of fallen timber and thick undergrowth, deeper into the wilderness than Enoch had ventured in years. The dog moved with purpose, pausing occasionally to verify the scent trail before pressing forward with renewed determination. His behavior reminded Enoch of hunting expeditions from decades past, when Jasper was younger and they'd tracked wounded deer through similar terrain. The forest grew denser with each step, creating a natural cathedral of towering pines and filtered sunlight. Moss covered everything in a soft green blanket, and the air carried the rich scent of decomposition and new growth, the endless cycle that kept these mountains alive. Enoch's limp became more pronounced on the uneven ground, but curiosity drove him forward despite the discomfort. "Easy, boy," he called softly as Jasper disappeared around a massive Douglas fir. "Let an old man catch up." When Enoch rounded the tree, he found Jasper standing perfectly still, his entire body rigid with attention. The dog was staring at what appeared to be a natural depression in the forest floor, overgrown with decades of vegetation. But as Enoch moved closer, he began to distinguish shapes beneath the green camouflage, straight lines that nature rarely created, metal fittings that gleamed dully through gaps in the moss. His heart quickened as recognition dawned, hidden beneath. 30 years of forest growth was the unmistakable outline of a covered wagon, the kind used by settlers heading west in the late 1800s. The wooden wheels were partially buried, and vines had woven themselves through the spokes like nature's own barbed wire. The canvas cover had long since rotted away, leaving only the wooden frame and metal hardware to tell the story of its abandonment. Enoch approached slowly, his mind racing with questions. How had a wagon ended up this deep in the wilderness? There were no roads within miles, no trails that could accommodate wheeled transportation. The nearest passage suitable for wagons was the old mining route that ran along the valley floor. But that was at least 5 miles away and separated by rugged terrain that would challenge even experienced hikers. Jasper circled the wagon with professional interest, his nose working overtime to process the complex mixture of scents that had accumulated over the decades. The dog's excitement was palpable, but he maintained the discipline that years of training had instilled. He'd found something significant, and he knew it. The wagon's construction suggested quality craftsmanship, reinforced axles, iron fittings that had resisted rust better than expected, and dimensions that indicated it had been built for serious travel rather than local transport. This wasn't a farmer's hay wagon or a merchant's delivery cart. This was the kind of vehicle that carried families across hostile territory, loaded with everything they owned and hoped to build in a new land. Enoch pulled out his pocket knife and began cutting away the worst of the undergrowth, revealing more details with each careful slice. The wood showed signs of deliberate concealment. Branches had been arranged to obscure the outline, and the positioning suggested someone had taken considerable effort to hide the wagon from casual discovery. This hadn't been abandoned in panic or left behind due to mechanical failure. Someone had carefully concealed it and walked away. As he worked to clear the vegetation, Enoch noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The wagon's tailgate was secured with a modern padlock, its brass surface green with age but still intact. Whatever was inside had been considered valuable enough to warrant protection, even in this remote location where discovery seemed impossible. The padlock presented both a practical problem and an ethical dilemma. Enoch had tools back at the cabin that could deal with the mechanical challenge, but did he have the right to open something that had been deliberately secured? The legal ownership was unclear. The wagon could belong to descendants of the original owners, to the state of Montana, or to whoever held title to this particular patch of forest. But curiosity won the internal debate, as it usually did with men who'd spent their lives following questions to their conclusions. Enoch returned to his cabin and retrieved a small crowbar from his tool collection, explaining his mission to Jasper as if the dog might offer legal counsel. "Finders keepers might not hold up in court," he told his companion as they retraced their steps through the forest. "But sometimes a man's got to know what he's stumbled onto." The walk back to the wagon felt longer than the initial journey, weighted with anticipation and the growing certainty that this discovery would complicate his carefully ordered life. Enoch had chosen solitude precisely to avoid the kind of moral complexities that human society seemed to generate with depressing regularity. The mountains offered clarity, right and wrong were usually self-evident, and consequences followed actions with mathematical precision. But as he applied leverage to the ancient padlock, Enoch realized he was about to step back into the messy world of human motivations and hidden agendas. The lock gave way with a metallic snap that seemed unnaturally loud in the forest quiet. And Jasper's ears pricked forward, as if he too understood the significance of the moment. The wagon's interior revealed itself slowly as Enoch lifted the wooden planks that served as a makeshift cover. Decades of moisture had taken their toll, but the contents had been wrapped in oilcloth that had provided surprising protection. His hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the first bundle, revealing a collection of leather-bound journals tied with string. The journals were followed by other items that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Weapons wrapped in oil-soaked rags, canvas bags that clinked with the unmistakable sound of metal currency, and official documents bearing the seal of the United States Army. Enoch's military experience helped him identify the weapons as standard Army issue from the 1890s, and the documents appeared to be payroll authorizations and transportation orders. One bag contained what looked like a small fortune in gold and silver coins, their surfaces tarnished but unmistakably genuine. Another held paper currency from the same era, crisp bills that should have been deposited in banks decades ago. The quantities suggested this wasn't personal savings or traveling money. This was institutional wealth that had gone missing from its intended destination. But it was the journals that held Enoch's attention most completely. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the kind practiced by men who understood the importance of accurate record-keeping. As he carefully opened the first volume, he found detailed entries describing routes, timing, and most disturbingly, the systematic theft of army payroll during transport. The entries read like a confession, written by someone who expected eventual discovery. They described a conspiracy involving multiple participants, detailed planning that had taken months to execute, and the ultimate decision to hide the evidence rather than risk exposure. The writer had documented everything with the thoroughness of a military clerk, creating an unintentional confession that could have sent him to prison for life. As Enoch read further, one name began appearing with increasing frequency, a name that sent cold recognition through his chest like winter wind. Marcus Dalton. Not the current sheriff, but someone with the same surname who had apparently played a central role in the theft operation. The handwriting identified this Dalton as a sergeant responsible for payroll security, a man who had used his position to orchestrate one of the most successful military thefts in Montana history. The implications struck Enoch with mounting force. Sheriff Marcus Dalton was approximately the right age to be the grandson or great-nephew of the man described in the journals. The family resemblance might extend beyond physical features to include knowledge of this hidden cache. Perhaps the current sheriff knew exactly where this wagon was hidden and had been waiting for the right moment to claim his inheritance. Or perhaps Marcus Dalton was completely innocent, unaware that his ancestor had been involved in criminal activity that could still destroy reputations and raise uncomfortable questions about the source of family property and influence. The journal suggested that the stolen payroll had never been recovered, making this one of the largest unsolved thefts in the territory's history. Enoch sat back on his heels, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered. In the space of a single morning, his simple walk with Jasper had transformed into something that could shake the foundations of Three Pines' social order. The evidence in this wagon could destroy the reputation of the town's most respected law enforcement officer, or it could provide answers to questions that had puzzled historians for generations. Jasper watched his master with the patient attention of a dog who sensed emotional turbulence but couldn't identify its source. The hound had done his job perfectly, following an interesting scent to its logical conclusion. Now it was up to Enoch to decide what to do with the discovery that would change everything. The forest around them continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human drama, and the complications that arose when past and present collided in unexpected ways. But for Enoch Rayder, the peaceful simplicity of mountain life had just become infinitely more complex. The walk back to his cabin felt like a journey through quicksand. Each step seemed to require more effort than the last, and Enoch found himself stopping frequently to catch his breath, though he knew the breathlessness had more to do with his racing thoughts than physical exertion. Jasper trotted beside him with the satisfied air of a dog who'd completed an important mission, occasionally glancing up at his master with what looked suspiciously like pride. Enoch had carefully rewrapped the journals and secured the wagon as best he could, but he'd brought one volume back with him. The leather binding felt heavy in his jacket pocket, weighted with more than its physical mass. Every few steps, he found himself reaching up to touch the outline through the fabric, confirming that the morning's discovery hadn't been some elaborate hallucination brought on by too much solitude and mountain air. The familiar sight of his cabin should have brought comfort, but instead it looked different somehow, smaller, more vulnerable, as if the knowledge he now carried had somehow changed his perception of everything around him. The neat stack of firewood he'd split last week seemed almost quaint in its ordinary purposefulness. The garden where he'd harvested the last of the season's vegetables appeared innocent to the point of naivety. Inside, the cabin's familiar warmth wrapped around him like an old friend's embrace, but even that comfort felt fragile now. Enoch set the journal on his kitchen table and stared at it while he made coffee with hands that trembled slightly. The routine of measuring grounds and adding water helped steady his nerves, but his eyes kept returning to the leather-bound evidence of crimes committed decades before his own birth. Jasper settled into his customary spot by the fireplace, but his attention remained focused on Enoch, with the alertness of an animal sensing distress in his pack leader. The dog had spent enough years reading his master's moods to recognize when something significant had shifted in their carefully ordered world. The coffee helped, its familiar bitterness providing an anchor point in a morning that had become increasingly surreal. Enoch opened the journal with the careful reverence of a man handling a loaded weapon, knowing that the words inside had the power to destroy lives and reshape the understanding of his adopted community. The handwriting belonged to someone named Thomas Dalton, and the entries began in the spring of 1892. The initial pages read like standard military documentation: duty rosters, weather observations, and routine complaints about army food and officer incompetence. But as the entries progressed, they revealed a growing dissatisfaction with military life and an increasing interest in the quantities of gold and silver that passed through Fort Benton on their way to smaller outposts. Thomas Dalton had been thorough in his record-keeping, documenting not only his own growing corruption, but the recruitment of accomplices and the development of an increasingly sophisticated theft operation. He wrote about bribing teamsters, falsifying shipping manifests, and creating elaborate diversions to mask the systematic looting of military payrolls. What emerged from the careful entries was a portrait of a man who'd convinced himself that he was simply claiming compensation for inadequate military pay and dangerous working conditions. The rationalization was elaborate and self-serving, but it revealed someone who understood exactly what he was doing and had calculated the risks with mathematical precision. The most disturbing aspect was the clinical detachment with which Thomas Dalton had documented his crimes. He showed no remorse for stealing money intended to pay soldiers who were risking their lives on the frontier. Instead, he wrote about the thefts as if they were legitimate business transactions, carefully recording profits and discussing expansion opportunities with the enthusiasm of a successful entrepreneur. Enoch found himself growing angry as he read his military service, providing a visceral understanding of what the stolen payrolls had meant to the soldiers who'd been cheated. These weren't faceless bureaucratic victims. They were men who'd enlisted to serve their country and had been betrayed by someone charged with their protection and support. The entries continued through the summer and fall of 1892, detailing increasingly ambitious thefts and the growing sophistication of the operation. Thomas Dalton had recruited accomplices at multiple locations, creating a network that could intercept shipments and redistribute the contents through civilian channels. The scale of the operation suggested organizational skills that would have served him well in legitimate business ventures, but it was the final entries that provided the most crucial information. In November 1892, Thomas Dalton wrote about growing suspicion from his superiors and the decision to suspend operations until the heat died down. He described caching the accumulated wealth in a secure location and developing plans for eventual retrieval once he'd completed his military service and established himself in civilian life. The cache location was described in terms that clearly identified the area behind Dead Horse Ridge, though the specific landmarks had changed over the intervening decades. Thomas Dalton had chosen his hiding spot well, remote enough to avoid accidental discovery, but accessible enough for eventual retrieval by someone who knew what to look for. The final entry was dated December 15th, 1892, and its tone suggested someone who was confident in his planning, but aware of the risks he'd accepted. Thomas Dalton wrote about his intention to complete his military service without arousing further suspicion, then return to civilian life and gradually access the hidden wealth to establish himself as a respectable businessman. But something had obviously gone wrong with that plan, because the cash had remained undisturbed for over a century. Either Thomas Dalton had been unable to return for his treasure, or he'd chosen not to risk exposure by attempting to retrieve it. The journals offered no explanation for this decision, leaving Enoch to speculate about what had prevented the original thief from claiming his ill-gotten gains. The immediate question was what to do with this information. Enoch could simply return the journal to the Wagon and pretend the morning's discovery had never happened. The crimes were ancient history, and everyone directly involved was long dead. Justice in any meaningful sense was impossible after so many decades, but the connection to Sheriff Marcus Dalton complicated any simple resolution. If the current sheriff was indeed related to Thomas Dalton, he might know about the cash and its contents. Perhaps he'd been waiting for the right opportunity to claim his inheritance, or perhaps he was completely ignorant of his ancestors' criminal activities. Either possibility created problems. If Marcus Dalton knew about the cash, then Enoch's discovery might be seen as interference with a family legacy, regardless of its illegal origins. If the sheriff was innocent of any knowledge, then revealing the truth about his ancestor could destroy a good man's reputation and career for crimes he hadn't committed. There was also the question of legal ownership. The stolen money had originally belonged to the United States government, and there were probably laws covering the recovery of stolen federal property, regardless of how much time had passed. The cash might legally belong to the federal treasury, making any private claim to its contents a federal crime. Enoch poured another cup of coffee and walked to his window, looking out at the mountains that had provided peace and clarity for 20 years. The peaks remained unchanged, eternal and indifferent to human complications, but their usual comfort felt distant now. He'd stumbled into a situation that demanded decisions he wasn't qualified to make, and actions that could have far-reaching consequences for people he barely knew. Jasper appeared at his side, pressing against his leg with the silent support that dogs offer when they sense their humans are troubled. The gesture reminded Enoch that some loyalties transcended the complexities of human moral reasoning, and some relationships were built on foundations that couldn't be shaken by discovered secrets or uncertain choices. But as he stood there wrestling with impossible decisions, Enoch realized that the peaceful isolation he'd constructed so carefully was already beginning to crumble. The journal in his pocket had connected him to the broader world, whether he wanted that connection or not, and there was no returning to the blissful ignorance that had characterized his morning coffee routine. The afternoon sun had shifted position by the time Enoch finally closed the journal, but he felt as though weeks had passed since he'd first opened it. The weight of Thomas Dalton's confessions pressed down on him like a physical burden, and he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the community he'd been observing from a distance for 2 decades. Jasper had grown restless during the long reading session, occasionally padding to the door and looking back expectantly. The dog's natural rhythms demanded action after extended periods of inactivity, and his subtle hints about the need for their afternoon walk were becoming less subtle by the hour. "You're right, boy," Enoch said, rising from the table with joints that protested the extended sitting. "A man can only think in circles for so long before he needs to move his feet." But as they prepared for their walk, Enoch realized he couldn't simply return to their normal routes and pretend nothing had changed. The knowledge of the hidden cash felt like a secret that demanded immediate action, even though he had no clear idea what that action should be. The rational part of his mind counseled patience and careful consideration, but his conscience insisted that some discoveries carried moral obligations that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. He decided to walk toward Three Pines, something he rarely did without a specific purpose. The 7-mile journey would give him time to think, and perhaps seeing the town from his current perspective would provide clarity about his next steps. If nothing else, observing Sheriff Dalton in his natural environment might offer insights into the man's character and potential knowledge of his family's history, the dirt road that connected his cabin to civilization wound through forest and meadow with the lazy curves of a path that had been designed for horse travel rather than automotive efficiency. Enoch had walked this route hundreds of times over the years, but today it felt different, like a bridge between two incompatible worlds that he was being forced to navigate. Jasper seemed to sense the purposefulness of their journey and maintained a businesslike pace rather than his usual investigative meandering. The dog's cooperation suggested he understood that this wasn't a recreational outing, but something more important, though he couldn't possibly comprehend the moral complexities that were driving their destination. As they walked, Enoch found himself cataloging everything he knew about Marcus Dalton. The sheriff was well regarded in the community, known for fairness and competence in dealing with the minor crimes and disputes that comprised most of his professional responsibilities. He'd served in the army. Enoch remembered hearing something about deployment to the Middle East and had returned home to build a family and a career in law enforcement. The Dalton name was well established in the area, with family members scattered throughout the county in various professions. They weren't wealthy by big city standards, but they were comfortable and respected, the kind of family that formed the backbone of small communities everywhere. If Thomas Dalton's crimes had funded that respectability, the revelation could destroy more than just one man's reputation. The closer they got to town, the more Enoch found himself questioning his assumptions about justice and responsibility. The crimes described in the journal were serious, but they'd been committed by someone who'd been dead for probably 60 years. The victims were equally dead, and the government that had been robbed had presumably written off the losses long ago and moved on to more pressing concerns. But the money itself remained very real, and its discovery raised questions that couldn't be answered with simple moral arithmetic. If the cash was recovered, who had legitimate claim to its contents? The federal government might have legal ownership, but their practical interest in century-old theft recovery was questionable. The current Dalton family might have moral claims based on inheritance, but accepting stolen money would make them accessories after the fact. Three Pines appeared gradually through the trees, its collection of weathered buildings and paved streets looking both familiar and foreign from Enoch's current perspective. The town had the tired dignity of a place that had seen better days, but refused to acknowledge defeat, with well-maintained buildings that showed the pride of residents who cared about their community, despite its economic limitations. The sheriff's office occupied a corner building on Main Street, its windows glowing with warm light that suggested someone was working late on administrative duties. Enoch could see a figure moving around inside, and his heart rate accelerated as he realized he was about to see Marcus Dalton with completely different eyes than he'd ever used before. He approached the building cautiously, keeping to the shadows that gathered in the spaces between streetlights. Jasper seemed to understand the need for discretion and stayed close to his master's side without needing verbal commands. Through the window, Enoch could see Sheriff Dalton working at his desk, his attention focused on paperwork that looked routine and uncontroversial. The man appeared exactly as Enoch remembered him, competent, methodical, and completely absorbed in his work. There was nothing in his manner to suggest someone carrying the weight of family secrets or guilty knowledge about hidden treasure. He looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a small-town law enforcement officer dealing with the daily requirements of his position. But as Enoch watched, He found himself searching for resemblances to the Thomas Dalton who'd emerged from the journal entries. The physical features were impossible to judge from this distance and angle, but there were subtler similarities in posture and movement that might indicate family connections. The way Marcus Dalton held his pen, the angle of his head when he was concentrating, these could be inherited traits that connected him to his criminal ancestor, or they could be meaningless coincidences that Enoch's heightened awareness was transforming into significance. He'd seen enough investigations during his military service to know how easily circumstantial evidence could be shaped to support predetermined conclusions, and he was determined not to fall into that trap. After 20 minutes of observation, Enoch had learned nothing definitive about Marcus Dalton's character or knowledge. The sheriff appeared to be exactly what he'd always seemed, a dedicated public servant doing his job with professional competence. Whether that appearance reflected reality or concealed deeper truths was impossible to determine from external observation. As they began the walk back to the cabin, Enoch realized that his impromptu reconnaissance mission had raised more questions than it had answered. He was no closer to understanding what he should do with his discovery, and his respect for Marcus Dalton as an individual had, if anything, increased. The sheriff's apparent dedication to his work made the possibility of destroying his reputation even more troubling. The journal in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step. Its weight increased by the growing complexity of the moral situation it represented. Enoch had hoped that seeing Marcus Dalton would provide clarity about his next actions, but instead it had reinforced his understanding that there were no simple answers to the questions that Thomas Dalton's confessions had raised. The walk home took place in gathering darkness, with Jasper's superior night vision guiding them safely along the familiar route. But for Enoch, the physical journey felt like a metaphor for his emotional state, navigating uncertain terrain with incomplete information and no clear destination in sight. 3 days passed before Enoch could bring himself to return to the hidden wagon. The journal had remained on his kitchen table like an unexploded ordnance, demanding attention while simultaneously repelling any desire to engage with its contents further. He'd read Thomas Dalton's confessions twice more, hoping to find some detail that would simplify his moral predicament. But each reading only deepened the complexity of his situation. Sleep had become elusive, replaced by long hours of staring at the ceiling while his mind cycled through increasingly elaborate scenarios. In some, Marcus Dalton emerged as a knowing beneficiary of his ancestors' crimes, using family knowledge to build his respectable life on a foundation of stolen money. In others, he was an innocent man whose world would be shattered by revelations about family history he'd never suspected. Jasper had grown concerned about his master's changed behavior, following him more closely than usual and offering the kind of constant companionship that dogs provide when they sense emotional distress. The hound's loyalty was both comforting and guilt-inducing. At least someone in Enoch's life maintained moral clarity about their obligations and affections. The weather had turned colder during the 3-day interval, with morning frost that warned of winter's approaching dominion over the mountains. Enoch bundled himself in layers that would have seemed excessive a week earlier, but the chill he felt seemed to penetrate deeper than skin and required more than physical warmth to address. The walk to the wagon felt like a pilgrimage to a shrine he wasn't sure he wanted to worship at. Each familiar landmark along the way reminded him of the simplicity that had characterized his life just days earlier, when his biggest decision was whether to split more firewood or repair the loose board on his porch. Now he was wrestling with questions that seemed to have no satisfactory answers, and consequences that extended far beyond his own peace of mind. The wagon appeared unchanged, its camouflage of vegetation and decay providing the same protection it had offered for over a century. But Enoch's perception of the site had been fundamentally altered by knowledge of its contents. What had initially appeared to be a fascinating historical artifact now looked like a crime. scene that was still awaiting resolution. He approached the cache with the reverence of someone handling evidence that could destroy lives or deliver justice, depending on how it was interpreted and used. The remaining journals beckoned from their oilcloth wrapping, promising additional revelations that might clarify or further complicate his understanding of Thomas Dalton's criminal enterprise. The second journal covered the period from late 1892 through the spring of 1893, and its tone was markedly different from the confident criminality of the earlier entries. Thomas Dalton wrote about growing paranoia and suspicion from his commanding officers, describing close calls and narrow escapes that suggested his theft operation was attracting unwanted attention. More disturbing were references to violence that had apparently accompanied some of the later thefts. Thomas Dalton wrote matter-of-factly about silencing witnesses and eliminating complications in language that strongly suggested murder. The man who had begun as an opportunistic thief had evolved into something far more dangerous, someone willing to kill to protect his criminal enterprise. The entries described the murders of 2 civilian teamsters who had discovered discrepancies in payroll shipments and threatened to report their suspicions to military authorities. Thomas Dalton wrote about these killings with the same clinical detachment he'd used to document his thefts, treating human life as another obstacle to be overcome in pursuit of his goals. Enoch felt sick as he read these confessions, his military experience providing visceral understanding of what the murders had meant to the victims' families and communities. These weren't faceless casualties of war, but innocent men who'd been killed for trying to do the right thing. Their deaths had enabled Thomas Dalton's continued theft and eventual escape from justice. The journal also revealed the scope of the criminal network that Thomas Dalton had assembled. Names and locations scattered throughout the entries suggested a conspiracy that had extended across multiple military installations and civilian communities. The scale of the operation indicated organizational abilities that could have achieved legitimate success if applied to legal enterprises, but it was the final section of the second journal that provided the most shocking revelation. Thomas Dalton wrote about his decision to abandon his theft operation and flee the territory before military investigators could gather enough evidence to arrest him. The plan involved deserting from the army and establishing a new identity in a different region, using the accumulated wealth to purchase respectability and status in a community where his past was unknown. The last entry, dated May 3rd, 1893, described Thomas Dalton's final visit to the hidden cache. He wrote about taking only enough money to fund his immediate escape, leaving the majority of the stolen wealth for future retrieval once the investigation had died down and his new life was established. The tone suggested someone who was confident in his ability to reinvent himself and eventually return to claim his full inheritance. But the cache had never been retrieved, which meant that Thomas Dalton's reinvention had either failed catastrophically or succeeded so completely that he'd never felt safe returning for the money. Either possibility raised troubling questions about the ultimate fate of a man who'd murdered for profit and escaped justice through careful planning and ruthless execution. Enoch carefully rewrapped the second journal and sat back on his heels, his mind reeling from the implications of what he'd learned. The discovery was no longer just about theft and family secrets. It was about murder and the possibility that a killer had escaped punishment by abandoning his victims and his crimes to start fresh somewhere else. The connection to Marcus Dalton had become even more problematic. If the current sheriff was indeed descended from Thomas Dalton, then he was potentially the heir to a legacy built on theft and murder. Whether he knew about that legacy or not, its revelation would destroy not just his reputation, but his fundamental understanding of his family's history and his own identity. The weight of this knowledge felt crushing as Enoch considered his options. Simply walking away was no longer morally defensible. The murders described in Thomas Dalton's journal demanded some form of response, even after more than a century. The victims deserved acknowledgement of their fate, and their families deserved answers about what had happened to their loved ones, but pursuing justice for crimes committed in 1893 would require exposing the entire cache and its contents to official scrutiny. Federal authorities would become involved, given the military nature of the original crimes, and the investigation would inevitably focus on any living descendants of the perpetrator. Marcus Dalton would find himself at the center of a media storm that would end his career and possibly expose him to criminal charges if any connection to the stolen money could be established. As Enoch made his way back through the forest, Jasper trotting faithfully beside him, he realized that his simple life of contemplation and solitude had been irreversibly complicated by forces he'd never anticipated. The journal in his pocket now contained evidence of capital crimes, and his knowledge of that evidence made him a reluctant participant in a drama that had been unfolding for over a century. The peaceful isolation of his mountain cabin had been shattered by revelations that connected him to violence, corruption, and moral complexities that he'd spent 20 years trying to avoid. Whether he wanted the responsibility or not, Enoch had become the custodian of secrets that demanded difficult decisions about justice, truth, and the price of both in a world where past and present collided in unpredictable ways. The third journal proved to be the most disturbing yet, written in a different hand and revealing that Thomas Dalton had not been working alone in his final crimes. The careful script belonged to someone, identified only as J.M., and the entries described a partnership that had grown from mutual greed into something approaching madness. Enoch read these pages by lamplight in his cabin, with Jasper sleeping fitfully nearby, as if the dog could sense the dark energy emanating from the written confessions. The unnamed accomplice wrote about the murders with an enthusiasm that Thomas Dalton's clinical detachment had lacked, describing the killings as necessary steps toward financial freedom and social elevation. The partnership between Thomas Dalton and his mysterious accomplice had apparently begun in early 1893, when military pressure on the theft operation had made solo crimes increasingly dangerous. J.M. had provided local knowledge and civilian contacts that helped disguise the stolen money's movement through legitimate business channels. In exchange, he'd received a percentage of the profits and eventual inclusion in the escape plan, but the relationship had soured as the pressure mounted and the violence escalated. J.M.'s journal entries described growing disagreements about methods and objectives, with Thomas Dalton apparently becoming more reckless and paranoid as discovery seemed imminent. The unnamed accomplice wrote about having to manage his partner's increasing instability while protecting his own interests. The final entries in J.M.'s journal were the most chilling, describing the murders of the two teamsters in graphic detail and revealing that additional killings had been necessary to protect the conspiracy. An army investigator who'd gotten too close to the truth had been found dead in what appeared to be a hunting accident, and a civilian clerk who'd noticed discrepancies in shipping records had disappeared entirely. What emerged from these confessions was a portrait of a criminal enterprise that had escalated from theft to systematic murder as its perpetrators became more desperate to avoid exposure. The body count suggested that Thomas Dalton and his accomplice had been willing to kill anyone who threatened their operation, regardless of whether those people posed an actual danger or simply possessed inconvenient knowledge. But it was the journal's final revelation that struck Enoch with the force of a physical blow. J.M. identified himself in the last entry as Jacob Marcus Dalton, Thomas's younger brother, who had established himself in civilian life near Three Pines, while his sibling committed crimes under military cover. The brothers had worked together to build a criminal empire that spanned both military and civilian spheres, with Jacob providing the local connections and Thomas supplying access to military resources. The family name that Enoch had been wrestling with suddenly took on new dimensions of complexity. Marcus Dalton wasn't just potentially descended from a criminal, he was potentially descended from two criminals who had worked together to commit theft and murder on a scale that boggled the mind. The respectability that the Dalton family had enjoyed for generations might be built on a foundation of violence and stolen wealth that made their current status a mockery of justice. Jacob's journal described his own escape plan, which involved remaining in the Three Pines area and using his share of the stolen money to establish himself as a legitimate businessman and community leader. He wrote about purchasing property, making strategic investments, and carefully building the kind of reputation that would insulate him from suspicion if questions were ever raised about his past. The plan had apparently worked perfectly. Jacob Marcus Dalton had succeeded in transforming himself from a murderous criminal into a respected member of the community, using stolen money to purchase the social standing that he'd been denied by birth and circumstance. His descendants had inherited that respectability without knowledge of its true source, building their own lives on foundations they'd never thought to question. Enoch set the journal aside and walked to his window, staring out at the mountains that had provided comfort and clarity for so many years, but now seemed indifferent to the moral complexities that were tearing him apart. The discovery had evolved far beyond his initial concerns about a single family's reputation. It was now about a systematic corruption that had shaped the development of his adopted community for over a century. The implications were staggering. If Jacob Dalton had used stolen money to establish himself in Three Pines, then much of the town's early development might have been funded by theft and murder. Property that had been passed down through generations might have been purchased with blood money, and businesses that had provided employment and stability might have been built on criminal foundations. More troubling was the possibility that knowledge of these crimes had been passed down through the Dalton family, carefully preserved as both insurance and inheritance. Perhaps Marcus Dalton wasn't an innocent man who would be shocked by revelations about his family's past. Perhaps he was the knowing beneficiary of a criminal legacy that he'd been protecting and perpetuating for his entire career. The sheriff's position would have provided perfect cover for managing any unwanted attention to family history. As the primary law enforcement officer in the county, Marcus Dalton would have been ideally positioned to suppress investigations, redirect inquiries, and ensure that questions about the past never gained enough momentum to threaten the present. His reputation for competence and integrity might be carefully constructed camouflage for a much darker reality. But even as these suspicions formed in Enoch's mind, he found himself resisting their implications. The Marcus Dalton he'd observed seemed genuinely dedicated to his work and his community, displaying none of the calculating ruthlessness that had characterized his criminal ancestors. If he was hiding knowledge of family crimes, he was doing so with an acting ability that bordered on the supernatural. Alternative possibility was even more disturbing, that Marcus Dalton was completely innocent of any knowledge about his family's criminal past, and that revealing the truth would destroy a good man for crimes he'd never committed or benefited from knowingly. The justice that the murder victims deserved might come at the cost of inflicting terrible injustice on their killer's innocent descendant. Enoch found himself trapped between competing moral obligations that seemed impossible to reconcile. The victims of Thomas and Jacob Dalton's crimes deserved acknowledgement and some form of justice, even after more than a century. Their families deserved answers about what had happened to their loved ones, and the stolen money deserved to be returned to its rightful owners. But pursuing that justice would require destroying the life and reputation of a man who might be completely innocent of any wrongdoing beyond the accident of his birth. Marcus Dalton had built a career on serving and protecting his community, and revealing his family's criminal legacy would end that service regardless of his personal knowledge or culpability. As Enoch wrestled with these impossible choices, he realized that his discovery had connected him to moral complexities that extended far beyond his own peace of mind. The journal in his hands contained evidence that could rewrite the history of three pines and potentially destroy the lives of innocent people, whose only crime was being born into the wrong family. The weight of this responsibility felt crushing, and Enoch found himself longing for the simple moral clarity that had characterized his military service, when right and wrong were usually distinguishable, and the consequences of action were immediate and measurable. The mountains that surrounded his cabin had provided refuge from such complexities for 20 years, but now they seemed powerless to shield him from the human drama that had invaded his sanctuary. Enoch was preparing to leave the wagon site when he noticed something that made his blood turn cold. Fresh footprints in the soft earth around the hidden cache, bootprints that were definitely not his own, made within the last day or two based on their crisp edges and lack of weather damage. Someone else had been here recently, someone who had approached the wagon and examined it carefully enough to leave multiple tracks in different locations. His heart hammered as he studied the prints more closely, his military training automatically cataloging details that might prove important later. The boots were modern, probably hiking or work boots, based on the aggressive tread pattern. The stride length suggested someone approximately 6 feet tall, and the depth of the impressions indicated a person of average weight, moving carefully and deliberately, rather than hurrying. Most disturbing was the pattern of the tracks, which showed that the visitor had circled the wagon multiple times before approaching the cache itself. This wasn't someone who had stumbled onto the site by accident. This was someone who had known exactly what they were looking for and had examined it with the thoroughness of a professional investigator. Enoch's mind raced through the implications. Had someone been watching him during his previous visits? Had his movements through the forest been observed and tracked back to this location? Or had someone else possessed independent knowledge of the wagon's existence and chosen this moment to investigate their own suspicions? The possibility that had been haunting him for days suddenly seemed much more likely. Marcus Dalton might indeed know about his family's criminal legacy and had been monitoring the cache site for signs of discovery. Perhaps the sheriff had been making regular visits to ensure that the evidence remained undisturbed, and Enoch's investigation had finally attracted the attention he'd been trying to avoid. But as Enoch continued to study the scene, he noticed additional details that painted an even more troubling picture. The visitor had not just examined the wagon, they had opened it. The careful arrangement of oilcloth and wooden planks that Enoch had restored after each visit had been disturbed and then hastily replaced. Someone had been inside the cache and had handled its contents. His hands trembled as he lifted the makeshift cover and examined the interior. The journals were still present, but their positioning was subtly different from how he'd left them. The money bags had been moved and examined, and the weapons showed signs of recent handling. Most ominously, several items appeared to be missing entirely. Documents that he remembered seeing during his first investigation were no longer present. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Someone had been systematically removing evidence from the cache, probably over multiple visits spanning weeks or months. Enoch's discovery hadn't initiated this process. It had simply interrupted an ongoing effort to sanitize the site and eliminate any traces of the Dalton family's criminal past. This changed everything. If Marcus Dalton or someone acting on his behalf had been managing the cache site, then the sheriff's innocence was no longer a reasonable assumption. The careful removal of specific documents suggested someone with detailed knowledge of the cache's contents and a clear understanding of which evidence posed the greatest threat to current interests. Enoch felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If his suspicions were correct, then he had stumbled into a situation far more dangerous than he'd initially realized. Rather than dealing with ancient crimes and moral complexities, he might be facing active criminal conspiracy. and people who were willing to kill to protect their secrets. The missing documents would have been the most incriminating evidence, probably. Correspondence between the Dalton brothers, detailed records of specific crimes, and documentation of how the stolen money had been laundered through legitimate business channels. Without these materials, proving the connection between past crimes and current wealth would be much more difficult. But whoever was sanitizing the site had made a crucial error. They had focused on removing the most obvious evidence while overlooking the psychological profile that emerged from Thomas and Jacob Dalton's journal entries. Those personal confessions revealed personalities and methodologies that might have been passed down through the family line, creating patterns of behavior that could still be identified in current family members. As Enoch carefully documented the scene with his phone camera, he realized that his investigation had shifted from a moral dilemma about revealing ancient crimes to a potential confrontation with people who were actively working to conceal ongoing criminal activity. The stakes had escalated dramatically, and his own safety might now be at risk. The walk back to his cabin felt like a tactical withdrawal rather than a simple journey home. Enoch found himself checking his back trail repeatedly and choosing routes that provided maximum concealment while still allowing reasonable progress. His military training had kicked in automatically, transforming a peaceful mountain hike into a covert movement through potentially hostile territory. Jasper seemed to sense his master's heightened alertness and stayed closer than usual, his own senses working overtime to detect any signs of threat or pursuit. The dog's cooperation reminded Enoch that they were now operating as a team in a situation that might require all their combined skills and experience. Back at the cabin, Enoch immediately began implementing security measures he hadn't needed for 20 years. He checked the locks on doors and windows, verified the ammunition supply for his rifle, and established observation posts that would allow him to monitor the approaches to his property. The peaceful sanctuary he'd built was being transformed into a defensive position, whether he liked it or not. More importantly, he began documenting everything he'd discovered and learned, creating detailed written records that would survive even if something happened to him. The photos of the Wagon site, transcriptions of the journal entries, and his analysis of the evidence were carefully organized and stored in multiple locations. If the people sanitizing the cache site decided that he posed a threat, at least his knowledge wouldn't die with him. The transformation from victim of circumstance to active participant in a criminal investigation felt both familiar and terrifying. Enoch had been trained for conflict and had proven his competence in situations far more dangerous than anything Three Pines was likely to produce. But that had been 40 years ago, when his body was younger and his responsibilities were limited to following orders and protecting his fellow soldiers. Now he was operating alone in a situation where the rules were unclear and the enemy was unknown. He didn't know how many people were involved in the cover-up, what resources they had access to, or how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets. His only advantages were his military training, his knowledge of the local terrain, and the element of surprise that came from being underestimated as an aging hermit. The phone in his cabin hadn't rung in months, but suddenly Enoch found himself staring at it as if it might provide answers to questions he was afraid to ask. He could call the state police or federal authorities and turn the entire situation over to people who were trained and equipped to handle criminal investigations. But doing so would end any possibility of protecting Marcus Dalton if the sheriff proved to be innocent, and it would certainly end Enoch's peaceful life in the mountains. Alternatively, he could confront Marcus Dalton directly and attempt to determine the truth through face-to-face conversation. But if his suspicions were correct, such a confrontation could be extremely dangerous, and Enoch would be giving up the tactical advantage of being an unknown threat. As darkness fell over the mountains, Enoch found himself facing a decision that would determine not just the resolution of a century-old crime, but possibly his own survival in a conflict he'd never wanted to join. The journal entries that had started as historical curiosities were now evidence in an active investigation, and his role had evolved from accidental discoverer to potential target. The peaceful isolation that had defined his life for 2 decades was ending whether he wanted it to or not. The only question was whether he would end it on his own terms, as an active participant in bringing truth to light, or as a victim of people who were willing to kill to keep their family secrets buried in the mountain wilderness where no one was supposed to find them. Sleep eluded Enoch that night as thoroughly as if it had been permanently banished from his mountain sanctuary. Every sound outside his cabin, the settling of timber, the rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant call of an owl, seemed potentially threatening. His rifle lay within arm's reach, and he found himself checking the approaches to his property with the systematic thoroughness of a soldier on guard duty. Jasper shared his master's unease, spending the night moving restlessly between the door and windows, his ears constantly alert for sounds that might indicate approaching danger. The dog's behavior confirmed what Enoch's instincts were telling him. They were no longer alone in their mountain refuge, and the watchers might not have peaceful intentions. By dawn, Enoch had reached a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He was going to confront Marcus Dalton directly, but not in the sheriff's office, where the conversation could be overheard or recorded. Instead, he would arrange a meeting in neutral territory where both men could speak freely without the constraints of official positions or public observation. The challenge was making contact without revealing his hand prematurely. A direct phone call to the sheriff's office would create a record of their communication, and it might alert other parties to Enoch's investigation. He needed a method that would appear routine while actually serving to initiate what could prove to be the most important conversation of both their lives. The solution came to him as he prepared his morning coffee, watching Jasper examine the perimeter of their property with professional thoroughness. Enoch would report a minor incident that would require the sheriff's personal attention, but wouldn't seem suspicious to anyone monitoring official communications. A reported trespassing incident near Dead Horse Ridge would bring Marcus Dalton to the area without raising questions about ulterior motives. The phone call to the sheriff's office was answered by Deputy Sarah Chen, a competent young woman who handled most of the administrative duties while Marcus dealt with field work. Enoch explained that he'd found evidence of unauthorized camping on his property and was concerned about potential poaching activity in the area. He specifically requested that Sheriff Dalton handle the matter personally, citing his respect for the man's judgment and experience. Deputy Chen scheduled the meeting for late afternoon, when Marcus would be finishing his regular patrol route and could investigate the reported incident without disrupting other duties. The timing would also provide natural lighting for any confrontation while ensuring that Enoch would have several hours to prepare for what might prove to be the most dangerous conversation of his civilian life. The preparation involved more than just mental rehearsal of his arguments and evidence. Enoch spent the morning implementing additional security measures around his cabin and establishing fallback positions in case the meeting went badly and he needed to defend himself or disappear into the wilderness. His military training provided frameworks for tactical planning that proved remarkably applicable to civilian criminal investigation. He also prepared detailed documentation of his discoveries, including photographs of the Wagon site, transcriptions of the journal entries, and his analysis of the evidence and its implications. Multiple copies were hidden in different locations around his property, and one was prepared for immediate transmission to federal authorities if something happened to prevent his return from the afternoon meeting. The most difficult decision involved Jasper. The dog's loyalty and protective instincts made him a valuable ally in any confrontation, but his presence might also escalate tensions unnecessarily or provide a hostage that could be used against Enoch. After considerable internal debate, Enoch decided to bring Jasper along, but to keep him at a distance where he could serve as backup without being immediately threatened. As the appointed time approached, Enoch found himself reviewing everything he knew about Marcus Dalton and trying to predict how the sheriff might react to accusations about his family's criminal past. The man's military service suggested discipline and honor, but it also indicated training in violence and deception that could prove dangerous if he was indeed protecting family secrets. The meeting location was a clearing near Dead Horse Ridge, chosen for its accessibility to official vehicles, while providing Enoch with multiple escape routes if the conversation turned threatening. The site was also within shouting distance of the hidden wagon, which might prove important if physical evidence was needed to support verbal arguments. Marcus Dalton arrived precisely on time, driving his official vehicle, but dressed in civilian clothes that suggested he was treating this as an informal consultation rather than an official investigation. He emerged from the car with the relaxed confidence of someone who expected a routine conversation about minor property issues, and his greeting was warm and respectful. "Afternoon, Enoch," the sheriff said, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed genuinely friendly. "Sarah said you were having some trouble with trespassers. Happy to take a look and see what we can do about it." For a moment, Enoch found himself hoping that his suspicions were wrong and that Marcus Dalton was exactly what he appeared to be, a dedicated public servant who would be as shocked as anyone by revelations about his family's criminal past. The man's manner seemed so genuine that it was difficult to believe he could be concealing knowledge of theft and murder spanning multiple generations. But Enoch had committed himself to this confrontation, and the evidence demanded answers, regardless of how uncomfortable those answers might prove to be. He led Marcus toward the ridge, ostensibly to show him the area where he'd found signs of unauthorized camping, but actually to gauge the sheriff's reaction to proximity to his family's hidden secrets. "Appreciate you coming out personally," Enoch said as they walked. "I know you've got more important things to deal with than an old hermit's property concerns." Marcus chuckled, a sound that seemed relaxed and unforced. "Part of the job, and honestly, I enjoy getting out of the office when I can. Desk work isn't really my strength, and it's a beautiful day for a walk in the woods." They reached the clearing that Enoch had designated as the meeting point, and the sheriff began examining the area with professional thoroughness, looking for signs of recent human activity. His movements were methodical and competent, but Enoch detected no signs of recognition or unusual interest in the specific location. "Don't see any obvious camping signs," Marcus observed after several minutes of investigation. "But that doesn't mean someone wasn't here and cleaned up after themselves. What exactly did you find that made you think there were trespassers?" This was the moment Enoch had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The next few words would either confirm his worst suspicions or shatter them completely, and there was no way to predict which outcome was more likely. "It wasn't camping equipment I found," Enoch said carefully. "It was something much older and more significant. Something that I think might have connections to your family's history in this area." The change in Marcus Dalton's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His relaxed posture stiffened slightly, and his eyes became more focused and alert. The transformation wasn't necessarily threatening, but it suggested someone who was suddenly paying much closer attention to the conversation and its potential implications. "My family's history?" Marcus asked, his voice maintaining its conversational tone, but with an underlying tension that hadn't been present before.
"What kind of connections are you talking about?"
Enoch studied the sheriff's face carefully, looking for signs of guilt, recognition, or deception. What he saw was primarily confusion and growing concern, which could indicate either innocence or exceptional acting ability. The moment of truth was approaching, and both men seemed to understand that the conversation was about to move far beyond property disputes and trespassing concerns. "There's something I need to show you," Enoch said finally. "Something that's been hidden in these mountains for over a century. waiting for someone to find it and decide what to do with the truth it contains. Marcus nodded slowly, his hand moving unconsciously toward his service weapon in a gesture that might have been defensive or threatening, depending on his intentions. "I think you'd better show me what you're talking about," he said quietly. "And then we can figure out together what needs to be done about it." The short walk to the hidden wagon felt like a journey across a minefield, with each step potentially triggering an explosion that would destroy the carefully maintained peace that both men had built their lives around. Jasper followed at a distance, his senses alert for any sign that his master might need protection or support. As they approached the cache site, Enoch found himself watching Marcus Dalton's face for any sign of recognition or prior knowledge. The sheriff's expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes were taking in every detail of their surroundings with the thoroughness of someone who understood that important revelations were imminent. The hidden wagon appeared through the undergrowth like a ghost materializing from the past, its camouflage of vegetation and decay telling the story of decades spent waiting for discovery. Marcus stopped abruptly when he saw it, his breath catching in what appeared to be genuine surprise rather than feigned ignorance. "My God," he whispered, moving closer to examine the ancient vehicle. "How long has this been here? And what does it have to do with my family?" Enoch watched the sheriff's reactions carefully, still unable to determine whether the man's surprise was genuine or carefully performed. But as Marcus began to circle the wagon and examine its construction and condition, his behavior seemed consistent with someone encountering an unexpected historical artifact rather than a familiar family secret. The moment of final revelation was approaching, and Enoch realized that regardless of Marcus Dalton's knowledge or innocence, both their lives were about to change irrevocably. The truth that had been hidden for over a century was finally going to emerge from the shadows, and its impact would reshape everything they thought they knew about justice, family, and the price of secrets that span multiple generations. Enoch pulled back the oilcloth covering and revealed the cache's contents to Marcus Dalton's widening eyes. The sheriff's reaction was immediate and visceral, a sharp intake of breath followed by a step backward as if the objects inside the wagon carried some form of physical threat. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, his professional composure cracking as he stared at the weapons, money bags, and journals that had been hidden for over a century. "Is this what I think it is?" "Stolen army payroll from the 1890s, Enoch confirmed, watching the sheriff's face for any sign of prior knowledge, along with detailed confessions written by the men who stole it. "Men who shared your family name." Marcus moved closer despite his obvious shock, his law enforcement training overriding his personal discomfort as he began to catalogue the evidence with professional thoroughness. His hands trembled slightly as he examined the weapons and currency, but his movements suggested someone encountering unexpected evidence rather than familiar family artifacts. "Thomas and Jacob Dalton," Enoch continued, pulling out the journals that had consumed his thoughts for days. "Brothers who worked together to steal military payrolls and murder anyone who threatened to expose them. According to these confessions, Jacob used his share of the stolen money to establish himself as a respectable businessman in Three Pines." The sheriff's face had gone pale as the implications of Enoch's words sank in. Marcus reached for one of the journals with hands that shook noticeably, opening it to reveal the careful handwriting that documented crimes committed in his family's name. As he read the first few entries, his expression shifted from shock to horror to something approaching despair. "This can't be right," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "My great-great-grandfather Jacob was a pillar of the community. He built half the businesses in Three Pines and donated land for the church. Everyone always said he was one of the most honest men who ever lived in the valley." Enoch felt a surge of sympathy for the sheriff, recognizing the devastating impact that the truth could have on someone's fundamental understanding of their family identity. But the evidence was undeniable, and Marcus Dalton deserved to know the full scope of what his ancestors had done and what legacy he'd unknowingly inherited. "Keep reading," Enoch said gently. "It gets worse before it gets better. But you need to understand what we're dealing with here." Marcus continued through the journal entries, his face growing more ashen with each page. When he reached the descriptions of the murders, he closed the journal abruptly and stepped away from the wagon, as if distance could somehow lessen the impact of what he'd learned. "They killed people," Marcus said, his voice hollow with shock. "My ancestors were murderers. They built our family's reputation on stolen money and covered it up by killing innocent people." The sheriff's reaction convinced Enoch that Marcus had been genuinely ignorant of his family's criminal past. The man's horror and revulsion were too authentic to be feigned, and his obvious struggle to process the information suggested someone whose worldview was being fundamentally challenged, rather than someone whose secrets were being exposed. "There's more," Enoch said, pulling out the photographs he'd taken of the recent footprints around the Wagon site. "Someone else has been coming here regularly, removing evidence and sanitizing the cache. Whoever it is knows exactly what they're looking for and has been working systematically to eliminate anything that could connect your family to these crimes." Marcus studied the photographs with professional interest, his law enforcement training helping him focus on the evidence despite his emotional turmoil. The bootprints were clear and recent, and their patterns suggested multiple visits by someone who was intimately familiar with the site's contents and layout. "These prints are maybe 2 days old," Marcus observed, his voice regaining some of its professional steadiness. "Whoever made them has been here multiple times and knows exactly what they're doing. This isn't random vandalism or treasure hunting. This is a deliberate cover-up operation." The sheriff looked up from the photographs, and Enoch could see a new understanding dawning in his eyes. Marcus was beginning to realize that his discovery of his family's criminal past was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous situation. "If someone in my family has known about this all along and has been actively covering it up," Marcus said slowly, "then they're not just protecting ancient family secrets. They're committing ongoing crimes to hide evidence of historical crimes. And if they're willing to go this far to keep the truth buried, they might be willing to go further." Enoch finished the thought that Marcus was struggling to articulate, "including silencing anyone who threatens to expose what they've been hiding." The two men stared at each other across the hidden wagon, both understanding that they had moved far beyond a simple historical discovery into territory that was actively dangerous. Someone with detailed knowledge of the Dalton family's criminal legacy was working to protect that secret, and they had just revealed themselves as threats to that protection effort. Marcus straightened his shoulders, and Enoch could see the sheriff's professional resolve asserting itself despite the personal devastation of learning about his family's past. Whatever Marcus Dalton's ancestors had done, the man himself was clearly committed to justice and the rule of law that his position represented. "We need to get this evidence to federal authorities," Marcus said firmly. "Military theft, interstate crimes, ongoing conspiracy to obstruct justice. This is way beyond anything my office can handle. But first, we need to figure out who in my family has been managing this cover-up and how far they're willing to go to protect it." The sound of approaching footsteps through the forest made both men freeze. Someone was moving toward their location with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Enoch's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket pocket, where the emergency flare waited as his final safeguard, while Marcus automatically positioned himself to protect the evidence while maintaining a clear view of the approaching threat. Through the trees came a figure that made Marcus's face go white with recognition and disbelief. Deputy Sarah Chen emerged into the clearing, but she wasn't wearing her uniform or displaying any of the deference that had characterized her professional relationship with the sheriff. Instead, she moved with the purposeful confidence of someone who was in complete control of the situation. "Hello, Marcus," Sarah said calmly, her hand resting on her service weapon in a gesture that was unmistakably threatening. I was wondering when you'd finally stumble onto our family's little secret. Though I have to admit, I didn't expect you to have help from the local hermit." Marcus stared at his deputy in shock, his mind struggling to process the implications of her presence and her words. "Sarah, what are you talking about? What do you mean, our family's secret?" Sarah smiled with cold satisfaction, clearly enjoying the dramatic revelation she was about to deliver. "Chen is my married name, Marcus. My maiden name was Dalton. I'm your cousin, descended from Jacob's younger son, who changed his name to avoid association with the family scandal. I've been watching over the family interests for years, making sure that inconvenient truths stayed buried where they belonged." The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. Sarah Chen had been perfectly positioned to monitor any official investigations that might threaten the family secret, and her role as deputy had given her access to information and resources that made her cover-up efforts virtually undetectable. She'd been the one making regular visits to the Wagon site, systematically removing the most damaging evidence while maintaining her cover as a dedicated law enforcement officer. "You've been stealing evidence from a crime scene," Marcus said, his voice hardening with professional outrage despite his personal shock. "You've been obstructing justice and violating your oath as a law enforcement officer." Sarah's expression didn't change, but her hand tightened on her weapon. "I've been protecting our family from the consequences of ancient history that has no bearing on our current lives. Those crimes were committed over a century ago by people who are long dead. There's no justice to be served, only reputations to be destroyed and lives to be ruined." Enoch had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding of how deeply the corruption had penetrated the local law enforcement structure. Sarah Chen's position as deputy had given her perfect cover for her criminal activities, and her apparent competence and dedication had prevented anyone from questioning her motives or methods. The murders weren't ancient history to the families of the victims, Enoch interjected, drawing Sarah's attention and allowing Marcus to adjust his position slightly. Those people deserved justice, and their descendants deserved to know what happened to their loved ones. Sarah's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Justice? You want to talk about justice for people who died before our grandparents were born? What about justice for the living members of the Dalton family who would be destroyed by these revelations? What about the innocent people whose lives would be ruined for crimes they never committed?" Marcus was studying his deputy with the careful attention of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew about a trusted colleague. "How long have you known Sarah? How long have you been lying to me about who you are and what you've been doing?" "I've known since I was a child," Sarah replied, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student. "The family has been protecting this secret for generations, passing down the knowledge and the responsibility to each new generation. You were supposed to be told when you turned 30, but your father decided you were too idealistic to handle the truth." He was probably right. The revelation that Marcus had been deliberately kept ignorant of his family's criminal legacy while his cousin had been raised with full knowledge of it added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. Marcus had built his career on principles of honesty and justice, never knowing that his own family had been systematically undermining those same principles for over a century. "So what's your plan now?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil he was clearly experiencing. "Are you going to kill us to protect the family secret? Add 2 more murders to the Dalton legacy." Sarah's expression remained cold and calculating as she considered her options. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to that. I was hoping you'd understand the bigger picture and agree to help cover this up for the good of everyone involved. But if you're going to be as stubborn and idealistic as your father feared," the threat hung in the mountain air like a physical presence, and Enoch realized that they had reached the moment where words would no longer be sufficient to resolve the situation. Sarah Chen had spent years protecting her family's secrets, and she wasn't going to let 2 inconvenient witnesses destroy everything she'd worked to preserve the confrontation that would determine The ultimate fate of the Dalton family's century-old secrets was about to begin, and Enoch found himself wondering if his peaceful mountain refuge would become the site of new crimes committed to cover up ancient ones. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours as Sarah's hand moved toward her weapon, and Marcus calculated his options for protecting both himself and Enoch. The mountain clearing that had been chosen for its peaceful isolation suddenly felt like an arena where past and present were about to collide with potentially fatal consequences, but it was Jasper who broke the deadly tension, emerging from the forest behind Sarah with the silent stealth that had made him such an effective hunting companion. The dog's low growl was the first warning Sarah had that she was no longer in complete control of the situation, and her momentary distraction gave Marcus the opening he needed. The sheriff moved with the trained efficiency of someone who had served in combat zones, disarming his deputy before she could draw her weapon and securing her hands behind her back with the same handcuffs she had carried as a symbol of law enforcement authority. Sarah's struggles were brief and futile, and her capture was accomplished without violence or drama. "Sarah Chen, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy to conceal federal crimes," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority despite the personal betrayal he was experiencing. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right until we can get federal authorities involved in this investigation." As Marcus secured his prisoner and called for backup on his radio, Enoch found himself feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. The immediate danger had passed, but the resolution of the century-old mystery would bring its own complications and consequences for everyone involved. The federal investigation that followed was thorough and comprehensive, involving agents from multiple agencies who specialized in historical crimes and recovered stolen property. The Wagon site became an active crime scene, with forensic experts documenting every detail of the cache and its contents, while historians worked to verify the authenticity of the journals and their revelations. Sarah Chen's arrest led to the discovery of additional family members who had been aware of the Dalton legacy and had participated in various cover-up efforts over the years. The conspiracy had extended through multiple generations, with each new family member being indoctrinated into the secret and assigned responsibilities for protecting it from exposure. The stolen army payroll was eventually returned to federal custody, though its monetary value had been far exceeded by its historical significance. The weapons and documents became part of a traveling exhibition about frontier crime and justice, helping to educate the public about the challenges faced by law enforcement officers in the late 1800s. Marcus Dalton faced the most difficult decisions of his career as the investigation unfolded and the full scope of his family's criminal legacy became clear. He could have resigned from his position and attempted to distance himself from the scandal, but instead he chose to cooperate fully with federal investigators and work to ensure that justice was finally served for crimes that had been hidden for over a century. The sheriff's integrity and dedication throughout the investigation earned him respect from both federal authorities and his community, and he was eventually able to continue his career despite the shadow cast by his family's past. The experience had changed him profoundly, deepening his commitment to justice and his understanding of how corruption could persist across generations if good people failed to confront it. Enoch found himself testifying before federal grand juries and providing expert analysis of the historical documents that had started the entire investigation. His military experience and careful documentation of his discoveries proved invaluable to prosecutors who were building cases against the surviving family members who had participated in the cover-up. But perhaps more importantly, Enoch discovered that his isolation from human society had been a choice rather than a necessity. The investigation had forced him to engage with people and institutions that he had been avoiding for 20 years, and he found that he still possessed The skills and temperament for such engagement, when circumstances required it, the relationship between Enoch and Marcus developed into something approaching friendship as they worked together to ensure that the investigation was thorough and fair. Both men had been changed by their encounter with the Dalton family's criminal legacy, and both had found strength in their commitment to truth and justice despite the personal costs involved. Three Pines itself struggled with the revelations about its founding families and the criminal money that had helped establish some of its most respected institutions. But the community ultimately chose transparency over comfortable denial, working with historians and federal authorities to understand the full scope of how the stolen money had influenced the town's development, the mountain clearing where Enoch and Jasper had made their world-changing discovery, returned to its natural quiet. But it was now marked by a small plaque that commemorated the victims of Thomas and Jacob Dalton's crimes. The memorial served as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved when ordinary people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths. As winter settled over the Montana peaks, Enoch returned to his cabin and his life of peaceful contemplation, but with a deeper understanding of his connection to the broader human community. His voluntary isolation was no longer an escape from moral complexity, but a choice made from a position of strength and self-knowledge. Jasper had aged during the months of investigation and testimony, but his loyalty and wisdom remained unchanged. The dog had played a crucial role in uncovering truth and achieving justice, and his bond with Enoch had been strengthened by their shared experience of confronting danger and emerging victorious. On quiet evenings by the fire, as snow fell outside and the mountains settled into their winter sleep, Enoch would sometimes reflect on the chain of events that had transformed his simple morning walk into a catalyst for historical justice. The discovery had cost him his peaceful anonymity, but had given him something far more valuable, the knowledge that even ancient wrongs could be set right when ordinary people found the courage to do what was necessary, the secret that had poisoned the Dalton family for over a century was finally buried, not in hidden caches or covered-up evidence, but in the honest acknowledgement of truth and the pursuit of justice that had taken more than 100 years to achieve.